February 1st, 1959. The northern Ural Mountains. Soviet Union. The temperature outside is minus 30 degrees Celsius. A death sentence for anyone caught without shelter. Inside a tent on the frozen slopes of a mountain the local people called Koletsyakal. 9 of the Soviet Union's most experienced hikers are sleeping. They are trained. They are prepared. They have survived conditions like this before. And then, something happens. Something so terrifying. So completely overwhelming. That all 9 of them grab their knives. Slash their tent open from the inside. And run, barefoot, half-dressed, into a minus 30-degree blizzard. In the middle of the night, they left everything behind. Their boots, their coats, their food, their equipment, everything that could have kept them alive. None of them made it back. And when investigators finally found their bodies weeks later, what they discovered was so disturbing, so physically impossible to explain, that the Soviet government sealed the files and buried the truth for over 60 years. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, and what really happened that night has never fully been answered. To understand what happened on that frozen mountain, you first need to know who these people were, because they were not careless, they were not reckless, they were not unprepared. They were some of the most capable young people in the entire Soviet Union. The year is 1959. The Soviet Union is at the height of its power. Sputnik has already been launched into space. The world's first nuclear power station is running. Soviet engineers and scientists are the pride of the nation. And nowhere is that pride more concentrated than at the Ural Polytechnical Institute in the city of Sverdlovsk, today known as Ekaterinburg. It is here that our story begins. Igor Dyatlov is 23 years old, a fifth-year radio engineering student. Tall, confident, methodical. He is exactly the kind of young Soviet man the state wants to produce. Disciplined, technically brilliant, and completely at home in the wilderness. He has been leading hiking expeditions since he was a teenager. He has built his own radio equipment from scratch. He has designed a portable stove specifically for winter camping. His friends described him as calm under pressure. Never panicking. Always thinking. He is the kind of leader people follow without question. Because he has earned that trust. Every single time. Around him, he has assembled a group of 9 others. 8 men and 2 women. All students or recent graduates of the same institute. All experienced winter hikers. All people who have done this before. In conditions just as brutal. And come home safely. There is Zinaida Kalmogorova, 22 years old, a 5th-year radio engineering student. Warm, funny, beloved by everyone in the group. Her diary entries from the trip are full of jokes and laughter and affection for her companions. She is not someone who frightens easily. There is Ludmila Dubinina, just 20 years old, the youngest woman in the group. Energetic, fierce, passionate about the outdoors. She had already completed several Category 3 expeditions. The most difficult classification in Soviet hiking. She knew exactly what she was getting into. There is Semyon Zolotaryov, 38 years old, the oldest member of the group by a significant margin, a World War II veteran, a certified ski instructor studying for his master's certificate in mountain hiking, experienced beyond any of the others in raw survival. He had survived things that would have broken most people. He had no reason to fear a winter hike. And then there are the others. Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonischenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Rustam Slobodin, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignol, all of them experienced, all of them capable, all of them trusted completely by Igor Dyatlov to handle whatever the mountains threw at them. This was not a group of amateurs. This was one of the most experienced winter hiking groups in the entire Soviet Union. On January 23, 1959, the group assembled in Sverdlovsk. The mood was electric, excited. The diary entries from that first day capture it perfectly. One member wrote, "Now we are sitting in room 531, frantically shoving oatmeal and canned meat into backpacks. Where are my felt boots? Can we play mandolin on the train? We forgot the salt. The room is an artistic mess. And here we are on the train. We sang all the songs that we know. Learned new ones. Everyone went to sleep at 3 in the morning. They were young. They were happy. They had no idea. Their plan was ambitious but well within their capabilities. A 190-mile ski trek through the northern Ural Mountains. Category 3 difficulty. The highest rating in Soviet hiking. 16 days from start to finish. Their final destination. The summit of Mount Otorten. A remote and beautiful peak deep in the wilderness. On January 25th, they arrived by train at Ivdel. On January 26th, a truck took them to Vizhay, the last inhabited settlement before the true wilderness began. And on January 27th, they shouldered their packs, clicked into their skis, and set off into the mountains. There were 10 of them when they left Vizhay, but there would only be 9 when they reached the slopes of the mountain that killed them. His name was Yuri Yudin, 21 years old. Quiet, kind, deeply loved by everyone in the group. He had been looking forward to this expedition for months. But on January 28th, just 2 days into the trek, Yudin's body began to fail him. He had rheumatism, a congenital heart defect, and now his knee and joints were in agony. Every step was becoming impossible. He made the decision that no hiker ever wants to make. He would turn back. He said his goodbyes to his friends on the morning of January 28th. At an abandoned geological settlement called Second Northern, he hugged them. He watched them ski away into the trees. He stood in the snow until they disappeared, and then he turned around and walked home. He never saw any of them again. Yuri Yudin would spend the rest of his long life. He died in 2013 at the age of 75. Haunted by that moment, he once told a journalist, "If I had a chance to ask God just one question, it would be, what really happened to my friends that night?" He asked to be buried alongside them in the cemetery in Ekaterinburg. That was his final wish. Meanwhile, the 9 continued on. Their diary entries from the final days of their lives are extraordinarily ordinary. Notes about the weather, complaints about aching muscles, jokes, songs around the campfire, plans for when they got home. On January 31st, Dyatlov made his last diary entry. He described the difficulty of setting up camp in heavy wind and low visibility. He noted that the group was tired, but he was not worried. They were close to their destination. The weather would improve. They would push forward in the morning. On February 1st, the group made their final ascent toward the slopes of Koletsyakal, the mountain the local Mansi people called by a name that translates simply as Dead Mountain. They set up their tent at approximately 5 in the afternoon. They took photographs, their last photographs, 9 smiling faces on a frozen mountainside, completely unaware that in just a few hours, something would happen that would leave the world asking questions for the next 60 years. That night, February 1st, 1959, the search teams would not find them for 3 more weeks. and when they did, nothing they discovered would make any sense at all. February 26, 1959. 3 weeks after the Dyatlov group was last seen alive, a search party finally reaches the slopes of Koletsyakal. Dead Mountain. What they find will haunt every single one of them for the rest of their lives. The tent is still there, partially collapsed, half buried under wind-blown snow. From a distance, it looks almost normal, like the hikers simply left it behind and went for a walk. But as the searchers get closer, something is immediately wrong. The tent has been cut open, not from the outside, from the inside. Someone, or something, forced those 9 experienced hikers to take a knife, slash through the fabric of their own shelter, and crawl out into a -30-degree blizzard in the middle of the night. The searchers look inside. Everything is there. The boots, the warm coats, the food, the equipment, all of it left behind. Not in a rush, but completely, as if the 9 people who owned these things had simply decided, in the space of a few seconds, that none of it mattered anymore. That whatever was outside that tent was so terrifying, that they would rather face -30-degree temperatures barefoot and half-dressed, than stay inside for one more second. The footprints lead away from the tent, down the slope, toward the treeline about a mile away. The searchers follow them. The first 2 bodies are found beneath a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest, about 1.5 miles from the tent. Their names are Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonischenko, both in their early 20s, both experienced hikers, both found in their underwear, barefoot. Their hands are burned. The branches of the cedar above them have been broken off up to a height of nearly 5 meters, suggesting that someone had climbed the tree desperately, possibly trying to see back toward the tent, possibly trying to escape something on the ground. The medical examiner's conclusion for both men is straightforward. Hypothermia. They froze to death. But here is the detail that stops the investigators cold. Krivonischenko had apparently bitten off part of his own knuckle. A piece of flesh was found in his mouth. This is not a wound you inflict on yourself while freezing to death. This is a wound you inflict on yourself in a state of absolute, uncontrollable terror. Between the cedar tree and the tent, 3 more bodies are found. Igor Dyatlov himself, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin. All 3 are found in positions suggesting they were trying to crawl back toward the tent when they died. Dyatlov is found face up in the snow, his fists clenched, his jacket unbuttoned. Kolmogorova is face down, still dressed in 2 hats and multiple sweaters. Slobodin has a fracture in his skull, a small one, but it is there. All 3 die of hypothermia. 5 bodies, 5 deaths from hypothermia. Terrible, but perhaps explicable. Perhaps they panicked. Perhaps something in the dark startled them and they ran. Perhaps they got disoriented in the blizzard and could not find their way back. Perhaps. But the story is not over, because the last 4 bodies are not found until May, when the spring snow melts enough to reveal what has been hidden underneath. They are found in a ravine, about 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow. And what the investigators find on these 4 bodies destroys every simple explanation that anyone had been clinging to. Ludmila Dubinina, 20 years old, the youngest woman on the expedition. Her cause of death is listed as massive hemorrhage of the right ventricle of the heart. Her ribs are crushed on both sides. The medical examiner will later say that the force required to cause these injuries is comparable to a car crash, not a fall from standing height. Not a stumble in the snow. A car crash. And then there is the detail that has haunted this case for 65 years. Ludmila Dubinina is missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips. Semyon Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old war veteran. His ribs are also crushed, severely, the same car crash level of force. No external wounds anywhere on his body. The force came from inside, or from something that left no marks on the outside. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, major skull fracture, no external wounds. Alexander Kolevitov, found alongside Zolotaryov. His injuries are described simply as unnatural. The investigators do not elaborate. For people, injuries consistent with enormous compressive force. No external wounds. No signs of a struggle with another person. No footprints of anyone else. No evidence that any human being other than the 9 hikers had been anywhere near that mountain. The medical examiner stares at these injuries and says something that becomes one of the most chilling sentences in the entire investigation. He says the injuries found on the bodies in the ravine are equal to the effect of a car crash injuries, on people who were standing in the snow, and then the radiation, weeks after the bodies are found. Investigators send several items of clothing to a radiological laboratory in Sverdlovsk for testing. The results come back in late May 1959. Some of the clothing is contaminated. The sweater of Krivonischenko, the pants of Slobodin, the clothing of Kolevitov, all showing elevated levels of beta radiation. Not lethal levels, not enough to kill, but real, measurable, unexplained. The official Soviet radiological report notes simply that the clothing contains radioactive substances beyond natural background levels, and that the contamination appears to have come from an external source. The investigators note it, and then they do something extraordinary. They ignore it. By May 1959, all 9 bodies have been recovered. The investigation has been running for 3 months, and the lead investigator, a man named Lev Ivanov, reaches the end of what he can officially explain. The tent cut from the inside. 9 experienced hikers running barefoot into a blizzard. 5 deaths from hypothermia. 4 deaths from injuries comparable to a car crash. With no external wounds. A missing tongue. Missing eyes. Radioactive clothing. And not a single piece of evidence pointing to any human attacker. What caused this? What made 9 trained, experienced, calm professionals abandon every survival instinct they had and run into the dark? The Soviet government's answer is delivered in a single phrase. The case is closed. The official cause of death for all 9 hikers is listed as a compelling natural force. That is it. That is the entire explanation. A compelling natural force. No further details. No elaboration. No attempt to identify what that force was. The files are sealed, classified, locked away. The families of the dead are told to accept the verdict and ask no more questions. And for decades, they have no choice but to obey. But here is what Lev Ivanov, the lead investigator himself, admitted 30 years later when the Soviet Union had collapsed and he could finally speak freely. He said he had been ordered to close the case by someone above him, someone he could not name. He said he personally believed that the orange spheres of light that multiple witnesses had reported seeing in the sky over Koletsyakhl that night had something to do with what happened to the Dyatlov group. He said he never stopped thinking about it. And he said, "I am absolutely sure that the secret of the Dyatlov Pass will one day be revealed." He died in 1999, still waiting for that day. The case is closed. The files are sealed. The families are told to be quiet. And for most governments, that would be the end of the story. But for anyone paying close attention, the Soviet government's handling of the Dyatlov Pass incident raises questions that are almost as disturbing as the deaths themselves. Because governments don't seal files about hiking accidents. They don't classify the deaths of students. They don't order search party members to sign non-disclosure agreements. And they don't restrict access to remote mountain passes for 3 years after 9 people die there from a natural force. Unless there is something they don't want anyone to find. Let's start with what happened immediately after the case was closed. For 3 years after the incident, the Soviet authorities forbade access to the area. Those involved in the initial search party and investigations were made to sign statements not to disclose anything about the case. And the case itself was classified. Think about that. Ordinary Soviet citizens, students, volunteers who had gone into the mountains to help find their missing friends, were made to sign secrecy agreements about a hiking accident, about a natural force, if it was truly just an accident of nature. Why did anyone need to keep quiet about it? The families of the dead asked questions. They were told to stop asking. The university where most of the hikers had studied asked questions. They were told the same. The local newspapers that wanted to report on the story were silenced. The entire incident was buried, officially and completely, under the weight of Soviet state power. The files were packed away until 1993, when they were finally declassified. 34 years. For 34 years, the Soviet government kept the full details of what happened to 9 young students locked in a classified archive. And when the files were finally released, investigators discovered that parts of them were missing, removed, gone. Someone had taken pages out of the official record before releasing it to the public. Now let's talk about the area itself. The northern Ural Mountains in 1959 were not simply a remote wilderness. They were a militarized zone. The Ural Mountains were a known testing ground for Soviet weapons during the 1950s, including missiles and nuclear experiments. The area was restricted after the incident, fueling cover-up theories. Not far from Kolit-Syakhl, the Soviet Union had been conducting weapons tests of various kinds. The last campsite of the Dyatlov group was located on the pathway from Baikonur Cosmodrome to Chernaya Guba, a Soviet nuclear testing ground. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is geography. The route the Dyatlov group was following passed directly through a corridor that connected major Soviet military facilities. Scrap metal of military origin was found in the area, leading to speculation that the military had either been using the area or had engaged in a cleanup before the search party arrived. And according to a witness statement from a former Soviet serviceman, the military had been testing parachute mines in the area at the time. Parachute mines detonate in the air, producing heavy internal damage with very little external trauma. The same kind of injuries found on the bodies in the ravine. And then there were the lights. Hikers 50 kilometers south of the incident reported seeing strange orange spheres in the direction of Dyatlov Pass on the night of the incident. Similar spheres were observed in the area continually during the period from February to March 1959 by various independent witnesses, including the Meteorology Service and the military. These were not fringe reports. These were not conspiracy theorists. These were trained observers, meteorologists, military personnel, all reporting the same thing: glowing orange spheres in the sky above the area where 9 people had just died. And the 1959 investigation noted these reports, and then was ordered to dismiss them The lead investigator Lev Ivanov stated that after his team reported seeing flying spheres, he received direct orders from high-ranking regional officials to dismiss this claim. Direct orders from high-ranking officials to ignore what multiple trained witnesses had seen in the sky on the night 9 people died. That is not how you handle a natural accident. That is how you handle something you need to keep secret. Now let's talk about what the Soviet Union was actually doing in that region at that time. Declassified Soviet military records indicate that during the same period, the USSR was exploring psychoacoustic and non-lethal weapons. These devices, designed to cause disorientation and panic, could explain the hikers' bizarre behavior, such as fleeing their tent in terror, as well as their physical injuries such as fractured ribs and skulls without external wounds. Infrasound, sound frequencies too low for the human ear to consciously hear, but powerful enough to cause profound physical and psychological effects. Extreme anxiety, disorientation, panic, the feeling that something terrible is about to happen, with no rational explanation for where that feeling is coming from. Experiments with infrasound had been documented in Western research as far back as the 1950s, and the Soviet Union, in the middle of the Cold War arms race, was absolutely exploring every possible avenue for non-lethal weapons that could incapacitate an enemy without leaving obvious evidence. A 2026 leaked KGB memo, which asked Soviet scientists to investigate whether the mountain's leeward slope could generate acoustic pressure capable of inducing panic response in humans, received a classified answer that was not released until recently. The answer was, possibly, under the conditions of February 1st and 2nd, 1959, possibly, under exactly the conditions that existed on exactly the night 9 people fled their tent in terror. And then there is the shadow of the KGB itself, behind the biographies of Zolotaryov, Kolevatov, and Krivonischenko. The brooding shadow of the KGB is distinct. Semyon Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old war veteran, was significantly older than the rest of the group. He had requested to join at the last minute, replacing another member. His background in military service and his insistence on joining an expedition of much younger students raised questions among investigators who looked at the case decades later. One theory that has been taken seriously by a number of researchers is that Zolotaryov, and possibly one or two others in the group, were KGB agents on an assignment, perhaps delivering something, perhaps photographing something, perhaps meeting someone in the wilderness where the KGB believed they could not be observed, and perhaps, whatever that assignment was, it went catastrophically wrong. The radioactive traces on the clothing of specific group members, not all of them, but specifically those connected to nuclear facilities and those connected to possible KGB work, support the possibility that this was not a random camping trip for everyone involved. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the new Russian government released what it said were all the details of the investigation, including photographs of the dead. But investigators who examined the released files immediately noticed something deeply troubling. Parts of the case files were missing, not misfiled, not lost, removed. Someone had deliberately taken pages out of the official record before handing it over. The missing pages covered specific periods of the investigation, specific witness interviews, specific forensic findings. The most sensitive material was simply gone. In 1990, lead investigator Lev Ivanov published an article that included his admission that the investigation team had no rational explanation for the incident. He also said something even more remarkable. He said he had spent 30 years thinking about what he had seen on that mountain. And he said, "I am almost sure that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the group's death." The man who led the official investigation, the man who signed off on the compelling natural force verdict, privately believed, for 30 years, that the orange lights in the sky had killed those 9 people, and he had been ordered, by someone above him, to say nothing. That is the cover-up. Not a perfect cover-up. Not a clean one. The edges are frayed. The missing files. The signed secrecy agreements. The restricted access for 3 years. The ordered dismissal of the flying sphere reports. The declassified records of psychoacoustic weapons research. The radioactive clothing on specific individuals. The KGB shadows behind certain members of the group. None of it proves exactly what happened, but all of it, every single piece, points in the same direction. The Soviet government knew something about what happened on Dead Mountain, and they spent 60 years making sure no one else would. 65 years have passed since 9 people died on Dead Mountain. In that time, historians, scientists, investigators, journalists, and thousands of ordinary people have pored over every piece of evidence, every photograph, every diary entry, every autopsy report, every classified document, and they have proposed dozens of theories to explain what happened. Most of those theories fall apart when you look closely at the evidence, but 4 of them, 4 theories, have survived serious scrutiny. Each one explains some of the evidence. None of them explains all of it. And that is exactly why this case refuses to die. Let's go through them, one by one, and let you decide which one you believe. Theory 1. Soviet military weapons test. This is the theory that the Soviet government worked hardest to suppress. And perhaps that alone tells you something. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were not wilderness. They were a weapons testing corridor. Some researchers suggest the hikers stumbled unwittingly into a military weapons experiment and were killed by something the Soviet Union was developing in secret. Here is what makes this theory compelling. The injuries on the 4 bodies found in the ravine are described by the medical examiner as comparable to a car crash. Massive chest fractures, skull fractures, internal hemorrhaging, but no external wounds, no bruises on the skin, no cuts, no marks, nothing on the outside of the body that could explain the catastrophic damage on the inside. There is one class of weapon that produces exactly this type of injury: shockwave weapons, devices that create a sudden violent pressure wave, like the kind generated by an explosion at a distance. The shockwave passes through the body, crushing internal organs, fracturing bones, without leaving a mark on the skin. Declassified Soviet military records indicate that during the same period, the USSR was exploring psychoacoustic and non-lethal weapons, designed to cause disorientation and panic, which could explain the hikers' bizarre physical injuries such as fractured ribs and skulls without external wounds. And then there is infrasound, sound frequencies so low the human ear cannot consciously hear them, but powerful enough to cause profound psychological effects. Extreme anxiety, paranoia, the overwhelming feeling that something is wrong. Something is coming. Something terrible is about to happen. A low-frequency sound caused by the wind going around the mountain could have incited panic in the group. Soviet military researchers in the 1950s were absolutely interested in weapons that could incapacitate soldiers without leaving visible evidence. 9. Experienced, rational, Trained people flee their tent in the middle of the night in -30-degree temperatures without their boots. That is not a decision any trained hiker makes unless their rational mind has been completely overridden. By terror, by panic, by something that bypassed every instinct and every training they had. Infrasound can do that. Shockwaves can do that. And the Soviet military was testing both. In the general area, at the exact time, according to a 2009 witness statement from a former serviceman. The Soviet military was testing parachute mines in the area at the time. Parachute mines detonate in the air, producing similar damage to those experienced by the hikers, heavy internal damage with very little external trauma. What does this theory not explain? Why only 4 of the 9 had catastrophic injuries, if a weapon was tested nearby? Why did 5 die of hypothermia alone? And why has no physical evidence of any Soviet weapons test in that specific location ever been found in the declassified archives? Theory 2, the avalanche. This is the official theory, the one the Russian government accepted in 2020. And it deserves to be taken seriously, because the scientists who developed it did serious work. In February 2019, Russian authorities reopened the investigation into the incident. On July 11, 2020, the official cause of death for all 9 hikers was announced as an avalanche. Here is the argument. The Dyatlov group pitched their tent on an exposed slope. During the night, a small slab of snow, triggered by katabatic winds loading fresh snow above the tent, slid down onto the campsite. The hikers felt the crushing weight and panicked. They cut the tent from the inside and fled. Some sustained internal injuries from the snow slab impact. They ran toward the treeline as they had been trained to do in avalanche survival. Started a fire, but were already injured and hypothermic. The snow den collapsed on those who sheltered in it, causing the catastrophic crush injuries found in the ravine. A study by scientists from EPFL and ETH Zurich published in 2021 suggested that a type of avalanche known as a slab avalanche could explain some of the injuries. It is a compelling argument, and the computer modeling is impressive. But here is what the avalanche theory cannot explain. The footprints leading away from the tent were consistent with individuals walking at a normal pace. Not running, not stumbling, walking. If a snow slab had just crushed your tent while you slept, you do not walk calmly away from it. There was no physical evidence of an avalanche found by the original search party. No disturbed snow pattern. No debris field. The tent itself was partially collapsed but not buried. The rescue team found few avalanche signs, and the injuries seemed inconsistent with those of avalanche victims. And the avalanche theory has absolutely no answer for the missing tongue, the missing eyes. These are not injuries caused by falling snow. These are not caused by a snow den collapsing. For 65 years, no avalanche theory has produced a satisfactory explanation for the soft tissue loss found on Lyudmila Dubinina and the others in the ravine. Theory 3. Radioactive contamination. This theory begins with a disaster that the Soviet government desperately tried to hide. September 29, 1957. A chemical explosion at the Mayak nuclear facility near the city of Chelyabinsk, just south of the Ural Mountains. The KYSHTYM disaster, one of the largest nuclear accidents in history, occurring just 2 years before the Dyatlov expedition. In the same general region, the explosion released massive amounts of radioactive material into the environment. The Soviet government classified the entire event, told no one, evacuated towns without explanation, and sent cleanup workers into the contaminated zone without telling them what they were cleaning up. Two members of the Dyatlov group had direct connections to that disaster. Georgy Krivonischenko had worked at the plant where the KYSHTYM disaster occurred. Another hiker had participated in cleanup activities. Both men had been in the contaminated zone. And the clothing that tested positive for radiation, it belonged specifically to those members. And to those who had been wearing or sharing their clothing during the expedition. Dyatlov Pass is not far from Chelyabinsk 40, where the Soviets built their first atomic bombs. Radiation was endemic in the 1950s in that part of the Urals. The contamination theory suggests that the hikers may have unknowingly been carrying radioactive material, possibly as part of a KGB operation to deliver fake evidence of Soviet nuclear capability to Western intelligence. And that when this was discovered by Soviet military personnel in the area, the group was eliminated, or alternatively, that they wandered into a still active contamination zone and were exposed to something that affected their physical and psychological state. What this theory struggles to explain is the specific nature of the crush injuries. Radiation poisoning does not fracture ribs without leaving external wounds. Theory 4, KGB secret operation. And then there is the darkest theory of all, the one that explains the most details, but requires you to believe the Soviet state was capable of killing 9 of its own young citizens. Researcher Alexei Rakitin proposes that Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, and Yuri Krivonischenko were KGB agents on a mission, the true objective of the ski trek, unbeknownst to the other members of the group, was to deliver radioactive samples to a group of CIA agents and to photograph the spies. The meeting took place on February 1st, but something went wrong. The CIA agents realized the trio was playing a double game. Conflict ensued, and the entire group was killed. Think about what this theory actually explains. Zolotaryov, a 38-year-old war veteran who joined the group at the last minute. Krivonischenko, who worked at the most sensitive nuclear facility in the Soviet Union. The radioactive traces on specific clothing. The injuries consistent with torture on specific bodies. The deliberate missing of soft tissues. The KGB secrecy orders. The missing case file pages. The sole survivor Yuri Yudin himself speculated about military involvement, citing the radiation and the restricted access to the area after the deaths. And the lead investigator Lev Ivanov, who had been ordered to close the case, privately believed until his death that something extraordinary and human-made had killed those 9 people. For theories, weapons test, avalanche, radiation contamination, KGB operation, each one explains something, none explains everything. And that is the truth of the Dyatlov Pass incident. Not that we have no answers, but that we have too many. And not enough of the right evidence to choose between them. The Soviet government made sure of that. They took the pages that would have answered the question. And they never gave them back. Here is the truth about the Dyatlov Pass incident. The truth is, there is no truth. Not yet. Not officially. Not in any way that closes the question and lets 9 families finally rest. 65 years after 9 young people died on Dead Mountain. There is still no conclusive determination of what killed them. No single explanation that accounts for all the evidence. No document that says, here is what happened. Here is who was responsible. Here is why. Nothing. The mountain keeps its secret, and the Soviet government made sure it would. There is one person whose story cuts through all the theories and all the arguments, and reminds us that this was not a mystery. It was a tragedy. 9 real people, with names, with families, with futures that were stolen from them on a frozen mountainside in the middle of the night. His name is Yuri Yudin. He was 21 years old when he turned back from the expedition in January 1959. His knee was too painful to continue. His body made the decision that his heart never would have. He waved goodbye to his 8 friends and walked home. He lived with that moment for the rest of his life. 54 years of survivor's guilt. 54 years of asking the same question over and over and never receiving an answer. He told a journalist in 2008, "If I had a chance to ask God just one question, it would be, what really happened to my friends that night?" In 2013, Yuri Yudin died. He was 75 years old. He never found out. He never got his answer. And before he died, he made one final request. He asked to be buried alongside his friends in the cemetery in Ekaterinburg. The friends he had left behind on the mountain. The friends whose fate had defined his entire life. That is not a mystery. That is a human being who carried loss for 54 years and wanted to be close to the people he loved, even in death. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the Dyatlov Pass investigation for the 3rd time. There was hope, briefly, that this time would be different, that the new investigation would finally access the missing pages, finally answer the unanswered questions, finally tell Yuri Yudin's memory and the families of the dead what really happened. On July 11, 2020, Russian officials announced their conclusion. An avalanche. The case was closed again. The families and researchers who had spent decades looking for answers were unsatisfied. The missing files were never addressed. The questions about the radiation, the injuries, the KGB connections were never answered. Russia chose the most comfortable explanation and closed the door again. Some truth, it seems, is not meant to be found. Here is what I believe. After everything I have shown you tonight, 9 extraordinary young people set out on an adventure in January 1959. They were the best of their generation, prepared, experienced, brave. They deserved to come home. Something happened on that mountain that night that the Soviet government understood and chose to hide. The secrecy agreements, the classified files, the missing pages, the ordered dismissal of witness testimony. These are not the actions of a government that doesn't know what happened. These are the actions of a government that knows and has decided that the world must never find out, whatever that something was. It killed 9 people who had done nothing wrong except be in the wrong place at the wrong time, on a mountain called Dead Mountain, on a night when the sky glowed orange, and the Soviet Union was testing things in the dark that it would deny for 60 years. The pass is named after them now. Dyatlov Pass. You can visit it. Stand where they stood. Look up at the same sky they saw on their last night alive. The mountain is open to hikers again. The Soviet Union is gone. The KGB has been renamed. The Cold War is over. But the truth is still somewhere in those missing pages. And those pages may never be found. 9 people. 9 names that deserve to be remembered. Igor Dyatlov, Yuri Doroshenko, Zinaida Kalmogorova, Ludmila Dubinina, Georgy Krivonischenko, Rustam Slobodin, Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignol, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov. They went into the mountains. And they never came back. And 65 years later, we still don't know why. If the story stayed with you, if it made you think about what governments hide and what mountains keep, then this channel exists for exactly this reason. We find the stories that were buried, the ones that were classified, the ones history tried to forget, and we tell them the way they deserve to be told. If you want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the bell, because the next story we're telling is darker, more classified, and even harder to explain than this one. The archives are deep, and we are just getting started.